The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood motionless, watching his pilots prepare for what many believed would be Japan's final stroke toward Pacific dominance. It was June 4th, 1942, and the combined fleet's most experienced carrier commander felt the crushing weight of 6 months of unprecedented victory pressing against his shoulders like an invisible burden. Since December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon of steel and fire. Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Singapore, each conquest had seemed to validate the strategic brilliance that had guided Japan's naval doctrine for decades. Yet as Nagumo gazed across the formation of 4 fleet carriers cutting through the pre-dawn darkness toward Midway Atoll, something gnawed at the edges of his confidence. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, appeared flawless on paper. The Midway operation would draw out the remaining American Pacific Fleet, particularly their precious aircraft carriers that had escaped the Pearl Harbor attack. Once engaged, Japanese naval aviation, the finest in the world, would crush the Americans in decisive battle, forcing the United States to negotiate a favorable peace that would secure Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, The Two-Ocean War, Japanese confidence at this stage remained largely unshaken, despite growing logistical challenges. But Nagumo, a cautious man thrust into the role of Japan's premier carrier tactician despite his background in battleship warfare, harbored private doubts that he dared not voice. The Americans had proven surprisingly resilient, and their industrial capacity, though not yet fully mobilized, represented a long-term threat that many of his colleagues seemed to dismiss too readily. Behind him, the organized chaos of carrier operations unfolded with practiced precision. Mechanics performed final checks on Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, their engines warming in the humid Pacific air. Zero fighters, the pride of Japanese naval aviation, sat ready to provide escort and combat air patrol duties. Everything appeared exactly as it should for what promised to be another chapter in Japan's string of victories. Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the Hiryu, had expressed similar confidence during the previous evening's briefing. The youngest Carrier Division commander in the fleet, Yamaguchi possessed an aggressive spirit that matched the prevailing mood among Japan's naval aviators. His pilots had distinguished themselves in every major engagement since the war began, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean raids that had sent British naval power fleeing westward. Yet even among the optimism, experienced officers like Nagumo understood the mathematics of carrier warfare better than most. Each plane lost represented not just machinery, but irreplaceable trained aircrew, men whose skills had been honed through years of rigorous training and combat experience. The Americans might possess greater industrial capacity, but Japan's naval aviators remained qualitatively superior, an advantage that could not be quickly replaced once lost. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the air group leader who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, moved among the assembled pilots with quiet confidence. His presence alone seemed to reassure the younger aviators, many of whom had joined the fleet since the war's outbreak. They looked to veterans like Fuchida as living proof of Japanese naval aviation's invincibility. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the cream of Japan's naval aviation capability. Together, they carried over 200 of the finest aircraft in the world, crewed by pilots whose training and experience surpassed anything the Americans could field. The supporting battleships and cruisers provided additional firepower that no American force could match in surface combat. As dawn approached, Nagumo felt the familiar tension that preceded major operations. The success at Pearl Harbor had made him a national hero, but it had also placed enormous expectations on his shoulders. Today's operation would either secure Japan's Pacific Empire or expose it to the first serious challenge since the war began. The admiral had no way of knowing that American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval communications for weeks, turning what should have been a surprise attack into a carefully prepared trap. At 5:30 in the morning, the signal flags rose aboard the Akagi, and the first wave of Japanese aircraft began their deadly dance into the lightening sky. 108 aircraft, 36 Kate torpedo bombers configured for horizontal bombing, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters lifted off from the four carriers with mechanical precision that spoke to months of relentless training and operational experience. Nagumo watched from the bridge as Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation toward Midway, approximately 240 miles to the northwest. The veteran aviator had specifically requested to lead this critical mission, despite nursing a wounded hand from a previous engagement. Such dedication exemplified the spirit that had carried Japan's naval aviation to unprecedented heights across the Pacific theater. The tactical situation appeared entirely favorable from the Japanese perspective. Intelligence reports suggested Midway's defenses consisted primarily of obsolete American aircraft and a handful of Marine pilots with limited combat experience. The atoll's strategic value lay not in its current strength, but in its position, a forward base that could threaten Japanese operations throughout the Central Pacific if left in American hands. Historical records from the Naval War College's archives indicate that Japanese intelligence significantly underestimated both American defensive preparations and the presence of 3 American aircraft carriers in the vicinity. Below decks, the organized chaos of carrier operations continued as maintenance crews prepared the second-wave aircraft for what they assumed would be a follow-up strike against Midway's airfield facilities. The plan called for Tomonaga's formation to neutralize the atoll's air defenses, allowing a subsequent invasion force to secure the islands with minimal opposition. Admiral Yamaguchi, aboard the Hiryu, monitored radio communications from the strike force with growing concern. Early reports from Tomonaga indicated heavier resistance than expected, with American fighters engaging the Japanese formation over the target area. More troubling still, the initial bombing runs appeared to have left significant portions of Midway's airfield operational, despite the considerable ordnance expended by Japanese dive bombers. At 7 o'clock, Tomonaga's voice crackled over the radio with a message that would begin to unravel Japan's carefully constructed battle plan. There is need for a second attack. The transmission sent ripples of concern through the command structure of the mobile force. A second strike meant the first had failed to achieve its objectives, and more critically, it would require rearming aircraft currently configured for anti-ship operations. The dilemma facing Nagumo crystallized with brutal clarity. His remaining aircraft were loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, weapons designed for attacking warships, not land installations. Switching to high-explosive bombs suitable for airfield suppression would require at least an hour of intensive work by his maintenance crews, leaving the carriers vulnerable during the critical transition period. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical mind who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, found himself caught between competing priorities. The original operation orders called for maintaining a reserve force ready to engage any American naval units that might appear, yet Tomonaga's request for additional support could not be ignored without risking the entire Midway operation. As the morning progressed, radar operators aboard the Japanese ships began detecting unidentified aircraft approaching from various directions. The contacts appeared too numerous and well-coordinated to represent random patrol flights from Midway's supposedly weakened garrison. Something was fundamentally wrong with their intelligence assessments. At 7:45, the first American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon, obsolete Devastator aircraft that should have been easy prey for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Yet their presence raised uncomfortable questions about American capabilities and intentions. Where had these aircraft originated? Midway's facilities seemed inadequate to support such organized attacks. The answer came with terrifying clarity as lookouts reported aircraft bearing the distinctive markings of American carrier aviation. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, three fleet carriers that Japanese intelligence had placed either in Pearl Harbor or under repair, were not only operational but positioned for coordinated strikes against the mobile force. Nagumo's tactical situation had transformed from a routine base suppression mission into a full-scale carrier battle, with his own ships caught in the middle of rearming operations. The initiative that Japan had maintained since Pearl Harbor was slipping away with each passing minute, and the admiral found himself facing the most critical decisions of his naval career. The illusion of Japanese invincibility began to crack at 8:37 that morning, when radar contacts multiplied across the scope displays of every major ship in the mobile force. What had begun as scattered reports of American aircraft attacking from Midway had evolved into something far more ominous: coordinated strikes emanating from multiple directions, suggesting the presence of American aircraft carriers that intelligence had assured them were either destroyed or safely harbored at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen in a moment of tactical paralysis that would haunt Japanese naval historians for decades. His flight decks remained cluttered with aircraft in various stages of rearming, bombs being switched for torpedoes, fuel lines snaking across the wooden planking, ammunition being moved from magazine to aircraft. The careful choreography of carrier operations had been disrupted by the urgent need to respond to Tomonaga's request for a second strike against Midway, leaving the mobile force in its most vulnerable configuration. Commander Genda moved frantically between radio sets and plotting tables, trying to coordinate responses to attacks coming from what seemed like every point of the compass. American torpedo squadrons pressed home their attacks with a determination that surprised even veteran Japanese sailors, despite flying obsolete aircraft that stood little chance against experienced Zero pilots. The courage displayed by these American aviators, though tactically unsuccessful, served as an ominous preview of the resistance Japan would face as the war progressed. According to Walter Lord's authoritative account, Incredible Victory, the Japanese task force found itself scattered across several miles of ocean, disrupting the concentrated anti-aircraft fire that had proven so effective in previous engagements. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise in a desperate attack against the Kaga, his antiquated Devastator torpedo bombers struggling to maintain formation under intense fighter attack. Though Lindsay's squadron would be virtually annihilated in the attempt, their sacrifice served a larger strategic purpose that neither side fully understood at the time. They were drawing Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high altitudes temporarily undefended. Aboard the flagship Akagi, damage control parties rushed to clear the flight deck of the dangerous mixture of aircraft, fuel, and ordnance that represented a catastrophic fire hazard. Nagumo's staff officers pressed him for immediate decisions about launching available aircraft versus continuing the rearming process, each option carrying potentially fatal consequences for the mobile force. The Hiryu, positioned slightly apart from the main formation, began launching whatever aircraft could be readied for immediate takeoff. Admiral Yamaguchi, the most aggressive of Japan's carrier commanders, recognized that decisive action was needed to regain the initiative that had been Japan's greatest strategic asset throughout the Pacific War. His pilots climbed desperately toward altitude, hoping to intercept American strike aircraft before they could complete their attack runs. At 9:20, Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise crested the clouds at 14,000 feet, their pilots scanning the ocean's surface for targets that intelligence had promised would be concentrated in a single formation. What they found instead was a scattered task force caught in the middle of flight operations, with 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers presenting perfect targets to overhead attack. The sight that greeted McCluskey and his pilots represented everything American naval aviation had trained for since the war began. Enemy aircraft carriers with their flight decks packed with armed and fueled aircraft, unable to maneuver effectively due to ongoing flight operations. The tactical situation was so favorable that it seemed almost too good to be true. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding the Enterprise dive bomber squadron, pushed over into his attack dive at 9:25, selecting the Akagi as his primary target. Behind him, 37 additional Dauntless dive bombers followed in precise succession, their pilots maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into them through months of training in Hawaiian waters. For Nagumo and his staff, the next few minutes would determine not only the outcome of the Battle of Midway, but the entire trajectory of Japan's Pacific War. The admiral who had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor now found himself in the impossible position of watching American dive bombers approach his flagship with the same tactical advantage his own pilots had enjoyed 6 months earlier. At exactly 9:26 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy experienced its first taste of the devastation it had inflicted across the Pacific for 6 months. Lieutenant Richard Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the Akagi's flight deck just behind the amidships elevator, detonating among aircraft being rearmed with torpedoes and bombs for the anticipated second strike against Midway. The explosion that followed represented more than tactical destruction. It marked the beginning of the end for Japan's naval aviation supremacy. Secondary explosions rippled through the flagship as aviation fuel ignited, creating an inferno that consumed not just aircraft and equipment, but the irreplaceable expertise of hundreds of experienced maintenance personnel and aircrew who had formed the backbone of Japanese carrier operations. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to his knees by the initial blast, struggled to comprehend how completely the tactical situation had reversed in mere minutes. The bridge filled with acrid smoke as damage control reports flooded in, each more devastating than the last. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was transforming into a floating crematorium, and there was nothing the most experienced carrier commander in the fleet could do to stop it. 2 miles away, the Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate as Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson's dive bombers found their mark with precision that would have impressed Japanese naval aviators. 4 direct hits in rapid succession turned the veteran carrier into a blazing wreck, her flight deck erupting in geysers of flame as stored ordnance cooked off in chain reactions that could be heard across the entire task force. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison noted in his definitive work that the destruction of 3 Japanese fleet carriers in the span of 6 minutes represented one of the most decisive tactical reversals in naval warfare history. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, found himself trapped below decks on the burning Akagi as damage control parties fought desperately to contain fires that seemed to have a malevolent life of their own. The irony was not lost on the veteran aviator. The man who had led Japan's most successful surprise attack was now experiencing firsthand the devastating effectiveness of American naval aviation when properly coordinated and led. The Soryu, attempting to launch aircraft during the American attack, became the 3rd victim of what Japanese survivors would later call the fatal 5 minutes. Her flight deck, crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, provided perfect conditions for the catastrophic fires that would ultimately claim all 3 carriers of the 1st Carrier Division. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the Hiryu, found himself in the impossible position of being the sole surviving carrier commander in a battle that had been designed to eliminate American naval aviation completely. His single remaining flat top carried fewer than 40 operational aircraft, a pitifully small force compared to the overwhelming strength that had departed Japanese waters just days earlier. The tactical situation had become a nightmare beyond the worst projections of Japanese naval planners. 3 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks that would have to be abandoned within hours. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators were dead or would die in the fires consuming their ships. The carefully accumulated expertise that had made Japanese carrier aviation the finest in the world was literally going up in smoke. Below decks on the flagship, Captain Taijiro Aoki fought desperately to save his ship, while Admiral Nagumo's staff debated whether the mobile force commander should transfer his flag to another vessel. The decision seemed almost academic. There were no other carriers available to receive him. and the supporting surface ships lacked the communication equipment necessary to coordinate what remained of the scattered task force. As the morning progressed toward noon, Japanese naval communications began reporting the unthinkable to Admiral Yamamoto aboard the distant battleship Yamato. The mobile force, the sword and shield of Japan's Pacific Empire, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. The carefully planned operation to eliminate American naval aviation had instead eliminated the core of Japan's own carrier aviation capability, leaving the Empire's Pacific defenses fatally weakened at the moment of their greatest apparent strength. By noon on June 4th, the sea around Midway had become a graveyard of Japanese ambitions, with 3 of the Imperial Navy's most prestigious aircraft carriers reduced to blazing hulks that would soon slip beneath the Pacific waves. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer from the doomed Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, watched in stunned disbelief as the symbols of Japan's naval supremacy disappeared one by one beneath columns of black smoke that rose like funeral pyres against the tropical sky. The human cost of the disaster extended far beyond mere statistics of ships lost and aircraft destroyed. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga, a veteran of countless naval engagements dating back to the First World War, chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon the men trapped in her burning compartments. His final radio message, "I alone am to blame for this disaster," exemplified the Bushido code that had guided Japanese naval officers for generations, even as that same code proved inadequate against the industrial warfare of the 20th century. Commander Takashige Agusa, one of Japan's most decorated dive bomber pilots and a veteran of Pearl Harbor, found himself trapped aboard the burning Soryu as explosions rocked the carrier from stem to stern. The irony of Japan's premier dive bomber pilot dying in fires ignited by American dive bombers was not lost on those who survived to record the battle's aftermath. Agusa's death represented the loss of tactical knowledge that could not be replaced through training or industrial production. According to Gordon Prang's exhaustive research in Miracle at Midway, the Japanese lost more experienced naval aviators in 6 hours at Midway than they had in the previous 6 months of Pacific operations combined. Admiral Yamaguchi, aboard the still operational Hiryu, faced the impossible task of continuing the battle with a single carrier against what appeared to be at least 2 American flat-tops. His aggressive nature, which had served Japan well in earlier engagements, now seemed almost suicidal given the tactical situation. Yet Bushido demanded that he attempt to salvage something from the disaster, even if it meant sacrificing his own ship and crew in the process. The afternoon brought a brief glimmer of hope when Hiryu's aircraft succeeded in damaging the American carrier Yorktown, forcing her to abandon operations and giving the Japanese their only tactical success of the entire engagement. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, leading the strike against the American carrier, pressed home his attack with the same determination that had characterized Japanese naval aviation since the war's outbreak. But even this limited success came at a prohibitive cost. The aircraft and pilots expended in the Yorktown attack represented the last reserves of Japanese carrier aviation in the Central Pacific. When American dive bombers found the Hiryu late in the afternoon, Admiral Yamaguchi had no fighters available to defend his flagship and insufficient damage control capability to contain the resulting fires. The loss of the Hiryu at 5 o'clock completed the destruction of the mobile force as an effective fighting unit. 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, had been reduced to burning wrecks in a single day of combat. The survivors found themselves scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean in destroyers and cruisers that lacked the capability to project air power beyond the range of their anti-aircraft guns. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, facing the same decision that had confronted his colleagues throughout the day, chose to remain with his ship as damage control efforts proved futile. His final message to Admiral Yamaguchi, "Let us die together," captured the fatalistic acceptance that had settled over the survivors of the mobile force as the magnitude of their defeat became undeniable. As darkness fell over the battle area, Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the distant Yamato, faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished naval career. The carefully planned operation to eliminate American naval aviation had instead eliminated the core of Japan's own carrier capability. The initiative that Japan had maintained since Pearl Harbor was irretrievably lost, and with it, any realistic hope of forcing a negotiated peace with the United States. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, though scattered surface engagements would continue through the night. Japan's dream of Pacific dominance had lasted exactly 6 months and died in the space of a single morning. The night of June 4th brought no respite from the catastrophe that had befallen the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving fragmentary reports from scattered survivors aboard destroyers and cruisers, struggled to comprehend how completely his carefully orchestrated battle plan had collapsed. The mobile force that had departed Japanese waters with such confidence now existed only as burning wrecks and oil slicks spreading across the Pacific swells. From the bridge of the battleship Yamato, positioned nearly 300 miles northwest of the disaster, Yamamoto faced the bitter reality that his strategic gamble had failed catastrophically. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year, now confronted the prophetic accuracy of his own prediction. Commander Minoru Genda, rescued from the waters around the Akagi by the destroyer Arashi, provided first-hand testimony to the speed and completeness of the Japanese defeat. The brilliant tactical mind who had helped plan Japan's greatest naval victories could offer no explanation for how American dive bombers had achieved such devastating surprise against a task force that possessed radar, experienced lookouts, and combat air patrols. Naval War College analysis later revealed that the destruction of the Japanese carriers resulted from a combination of tactical errors, communication failures, and simple misfortune that no amount of planning could have prevented. The human toll of the disaster extended beyond the immediate battle casualties to encompass the broader strategic implications for Japan's position in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Shigeo Suganami, one of the few surviving air group leaders, reported that the mobile force had lost not just aircraft and ships, but the irreplaceable core of experienced maintenance personnel who had made Japanese carrier operations the most efficient in the world. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu, choosing death over surrender, remained at his post as his carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking with her decades of operational experience and institutional knowledge that had made Japanese naval aviation supreme across the Pacific. His sacrifice, though honoring the Bushido tradition, represented a broader pattern of Japan's best naval officers choosing death over the shame of defeat. Aboard the heavy cruiser Tone, Admiral Hiroaki Abe attempted to coordinate what remained of the scattered Japanese forces for a night surface engagement that might salvage something from the disaster. The veteran commander, who had led battleship formation since the war's outbreak, recognized that traditional surface warfare represented Japan's last hope of inflicting meaningful damage on American forces in the area. But even this desperate measure faced insurmountable obstacles. American radar technology, superior to anything available to Japanese ships, would provide advance warning of any surface approach. The element of surprise that had served Japan so well at Pearl Harbor and throughout the early Pacific campaigns was now firmly in American hands. The destroyers Arashi, Nowaki, and Hamikaze, racing through the darkness to rescue survivors from the burning carriers, carried with them the shattered remnants of Japanese naval aviation. Lieutenant Haruo Yoshino, pulled from the oil-covered waters around the Kaga, would later write that watching his carrier disappear beneath the waves felt like witnessing the death of the Japanese Empire itself. As dawn approached on June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto faced a decision that would define the remainder of Japan's Pacific War. The Midway operation had been designed to eliminate American naval aviation and force a negotiated peace that would secure Japan's conquests. Instead, It had eliminated the core of Japan's own naval aviation capability while leaving American carriers largely intact and their industrial base untouched. The scattered remnants of the mobile force began their retreat toward Japan, carrying news of a defeat so complete that many senior officers would initially refuse to believe the reports. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, had been shattered in the space of a single morning by American pilots flying obsolete aircraft from supposedly weakened carriers. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned irrevocably, though neither side yet fully understood the long-term implications of what had transpired in the waters around Midway Atoll. The morning of June 5th revealed the full magnitude of Japan's naval catastrophe as search aircraft reported 4 distinct oil slicks marking the graves of the mobile force's aircraft carriers. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato, stared at situation reports that read like a catalog of everything that could go wrong in naval warfare, each page documenting another aspect of the complete tactical collapse that had transformed Japan's greatest strength into its most devastating weakness. The retreat from Midway began not as an organized withdrawal, but as a desperate flight by scattered surface ships carrying the survivors of what had been the most powerful naval aviation force in the world. Destroyer captains found themselves commanding vessels crammed with rescued aircrew and carrier personnel, many suffering from burns and injuries that would have overwhelmed any single ship's medical facilities. Captain Tomotsu Oishi of the destroyer Arashi, one of the rescue vessels, reported that many of the survivors seemed more psychologically damaged than physically wounded. These were men who had participated in every major Japanese naval victory since Pearl Harbor, aviators and sailors who had come to view Japanese naval superiority as a natural law. The speed and completeness of their defeat had shattered not just their tactical formations, but their fundamental understanding of their place in the war. According to historian John Lundstrom's detailed analysis in The First Team, the psychological impact of the Midway defeat on surviving Japanese naval personnel would affect operational effectiveness for the remainder of the Pacific War. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, rescued from the waters around the flagship Akagi, spent the voyage back to Japan attempting to understand how American naval aviation had achieved such devastating tactical surprise. The hero of Pearl Harbor, whose detailed planning had made that attack possible, found himself confronting the uncomfortable reality that American pilots had duplicated his success using many of the same tactical principles he had pioneered. The loss of institutional knowledge represented perhaps the most serious long-term consequence of the Midway disaster. Chief Petty Officer Juzo Mori, a veteran maintenance supervisor from the Kaga, had trained dozens of younger technicians in the complex procedures required to maintain carrier aviation operations. His death in the fires that consumed his carrier eliminated decades of accumulated expertise that could not be replaced through normal training programs. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, one of Japan's most experienced torpedo bomber leaders, had survived the destruction of his aircraft only to drown when the Akagi's aviation fuel tanks ruptured and spread burning oil across the surrounding water. His loss represented not just the death of an individual pilot, but the elimination of tactical knowledge that had been developed through years of combat experience across the Pacific theater. Admiral Nagumo, transferred to the light cruiser Nagara for the retreat, faced the impossible task of explaining to Imperial Naval Headquarters how the mobile force had been completely destroyed while inflicting minimal damage on American forces. The admiral who had been hailed as the architect of Pearl Harbor would now bear responsibility for Japan's first major naval defeat since the 19th century. The scattered remnants of destroyer and cruiser squadrons that had supported the mobile force found themselves essentially defenseless against American submarine attacks during the long voyage back to Japan. Without carrier aviation to provide air cover, these surface ships relied entirely on luck and speed to avoid the growing number of American submarines that were beginning to patrol Japanese supply routes with increasing effectiveness. By June 10th, the surviving ships began arriving at Japanese ports, carrying news that would fundamentally alter Japan's strategic planning for the remainder of the Pacific War. The dream of eliminating American naval aviation through decisive battle had resulted in the elimination of Japan's own carrier aviation capability, leaving the empire's Pacific defenses dependent on land-based aircraft with limited range and effectiveness. The officers and men who returned from Midway carried with them not just physical wounds, but the psychological burden of having witnessed the beginning of Japan's inevitable defeat. The initiative that had carried Japanese forces across the Pacific in 6 months of unprecedented victory had been irretrievably lost in the waters around an obscure atoll that few Japanese had heard of before June 4, 1942. The final chapter of the Midway disaster was written not in the heat of battle, but in the sterile conference rooms of Imperial Naval Headquarters, where staff officers struggled to comprehend reports that seemed to describe the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, read and reread casualty lists that documented not just the loss of 4 fleet carriers, but the destruction of the institutional knowledge that had made Japanese naval aviation supreme across the Pacific theater. The arithmetic of the defeat was undeniable and devastating. In exchange for damaging a single American carrier, the Yorktown, which would be repaired and returned to service, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and most critically, hundreds of experienced aircrew whose training and combat experience could not be replaced within the time frame of a global war against American industrial capacity. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the few surviving architects of Japanese carrier aviation doctrine, found himself tasked with analyzing what had gone wrong at Midway. His conclusions, delivered in a confidential report that would influence Japanese naval strategy for the remainder of the war, identified not tactical errors, but fundamental strategic miscalculations that had left Japan vulnerable to exactly the kind of coordinated attack that American forces had executed with such devastating effectiveness. Historical analysis conducted by the U.S. Naval War College in the post-war period confirmed that the Battle of Midway represented the decisive turning point in the Pacific War, marking the transition from Japanese offensive operations to a defensive strategy that could only delay inevitable defeat. The broader implications of Midway extended far beyond naval aviation to encompass Japan's entire strategic position in the Pacific. The mobile force had represented not just tactical capability, but the symbol of Japanese technological and military superiority that had justified the empire's expansion across the Pacific. Its destruction in a single morning shattered the myth of invincibility that had sustained Japanese morale through 6 months of unprecedented conquest. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, withdrew to his private quarters aboard the Yamato to contemplate the strategic implications of what had transpired. The man who had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year had seen his prediction fulfilled with prophetic accuracy. The brief period of Japanese naval supremacy had ended precisely as he had anticipated, leaving the empire facing a prolonged war against an industrial power that could replace its losses while Japan could not. The human stories of Midway's aftermath revealed the personal cost of strategic failure. Lieutenant Haruo Yoshino, one of the few surviving pilots from the Kaga, returned to Japan carrying not just physical injuries, but survivor's guilt that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His detailed debriefing provided crucial intelligence about American tactics and capabilities, but his psychological wounds reflected the broader trauma experienced by an entire generation of Japanese naval personnel. Captain Jisaku Okada's decision to go down with the Kaga, while honoring the Bushido tradition, exemplified the broader pattern of Japan's most experienced officers choosing death over the shame of defeat. This cultural response to military failure, though consistent with Japanese military tradition, ensured that critical operational knowledge died with the ships and men who possessed it. The rebuilt Japanese carrier force that emerged from the Midway disaster would never again achieve the qualitative superiority that had made the original mobile force so devastatingly effective. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training programs, lacked the experience and skill of the veterans lost at Midway. New carriers, constructed under wartime conditions, incorporated design compromises that made them less capable than their predecessors. As 1942 drew to a close, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to American forces. The industrial capacity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared would prove decisive was already producing new aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them, while American pilot training programs were turning out air crew in numbers that Japanese industry could never match. The fire that had consumed Japan's carriers at Midway had indeed consumed their legacy, not just the ships and aircraft lost in battle, but the dream of Pacific Empire that had motivated Japanese expansion since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The rising sun had begun its inevitable descent toward defeat.